When we found out 10 minutes from the Baton Rouge airport that we ran out of gas, and I just heard the pilot go, "Oh my God."
Pilot McCreary turns his plane to the left and starts back toward Macomb. His altimeter reads 2,000 feet. The time is just past 6 o'clock. One of the engines on the Convair quits, probably starved for fuel.
I remember waking up to the helicopters were hovering, you know, shining lights down in the swamp. It's like Vietnam in my head. I only seen it on TV, but the helicopters and your buddies screaming and yelling in pain and dying around you.
American rock band Lynyrd Skynyrd rose to prominence in the 1970s. Their debut album in 1973 featured the massive hits Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, and Freebird. And they followed that up in 1974 with their second album titled Second Helping, with this album featuring the band's most well-known song and the massive hit Sweet Home Alabama. Skynyrd went on to release 3 more studio albums, but it was after the release of their 5th album, Street Survivors, in 1977 where tragedy struck. The album was released on October 17th. 2 days after, on the 19th, the band were kicking off their tour. They played a show at the Greenville Memorial Auditorium in South Carolina, but little did they know that this would be the final show they would ever play together. The following day, October 20th, 1977, the band boarded a Convair CV-240 airplane, which was bound for Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the band were scheduled to play their next show at the Louisiana State University. But tragically, they didn't make it. The Convair airplane that the band had boarded was known to have had some issues with it pre-crash. In fact, Aerosmith had looked at using the plane just months before the tragic crash, but their management turned it down due to a sketchy mechanical history. Also, just 2 days prior to the crash, it was noted that there were flames several feet long coming from one of the plane's engines. Needless to say, this had several of the passengers, including band members, not wanting to board that plane on what would be the fateful trip to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But as the story goes, they were talked into it, and the rest, sadly, is now history.
Everybody was playing poker. I remember Ronnie did have a little hangover, so he just threw a pillow down and was laid on the floor. And all of a sudden, you could really feel a little sputtering and spitting.
I was in the cockpit, in the navigator jump seat, in between the pilot and the co-pilot. I looked at Walter McCreary and I said, "We can fly on one engine, right?" He looked at me with fear in his eyes, and I saw it. His eyes were bugging out. He said, "Artemis, you better go back and strap yourself in."
The pilot sent the co-pilot back to say, "Hey, we're gonna make a landing and try to see what's happening here. So it might be a little rough, so put your heads between your legs." We started hitting the treetops real, you could hear them, and it got louder and louder until it just got so overwhelming, loud and bumping that's when I guess, got knocked out.
The crash occurred at approximately 6:30 p.m. that evening. Here, drummer of Lynyrd Skynyrd, Artemis Pyle, shares his story. After the crash, he went for help. He made it to a nearby farmhouse where he encountered a man there.
He was just protecting his family. That's all.
He had a gun and told Artemis, who was covered in blood, to stop.
I was stumbling, and I moved forward, and he fired and caught me in the shoulder. And it spun me around. I yelled plane crash with what I thought was my last breath.
Luckily, Artemis wasn't injured too badly, and the man ended up helping him in the end.
Neighbors who'd heard the crash were among the first rescue workers to arrive.
We walked through the woods to the site. And at that time, there was nobody on the site. Well, we started getting them out then, getting the ones that were hurt out, and everybody's out too.
Under the glare of helicopter floodlights, the 23 victims were pulled one by one from the wreckage, placed on stretchers, and carried 100 yards through dense woods and across a creek to waiting ambulances. They were rushed to Southwest Mississippi Medical Center in Macomb.
Ultimately, the aircraft had run out of fuel. 26 people were aboard that plane that day. 20 survived, however, 6 did not. Those 6 were the pilot and the co-pilot, the assistant manager for the band, guitarist Steve Gaines and his older sister, who was the backup vocalist for the band, Cassie Gaines, and, of course, frontman and lead singer for Lynyrd Skynyrd, Ronnie Van Zant. Of the 20 who did survive the crash, all suffered serious injuries. It was the passengers who were situated near the back of the plane during the crash. They were the ones who survived. But most everybody who was up near the front of the plane, they were the ones who perished. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, stated that it was amazing that anybody survived that crash. After the tragedy, and now with frontman Ronnie Van Zant gone, Lynyrd Skynyrd disbanded. However, in 1987, 10 years after the crash, Lynyrd Skynyrd got back together. Crash survivors Gary Rossington, Billy Powell, Leon Wilkinson, and Artemis Pyle, along with guitarist Ed King, who had left the band 2 years before the crash, reunited with Ronnie Van Zant's younger brother Johnny, who is now the new lead singer for the band, and the band went on what was to be just a one-off tour. However, that one-off tour turned into a full reformation of the band, and between 1991 and 2012, the band went on to record a further 9 albums. Lineups changed during that time, and original band members passed away also over those years, with guitarist Gary Rossington, the last original member of the band, passing away on March 5th, 2023, meaning now all of the original members of Lynyrd Skynyrd have died. It was in October of 2019, 42 years after the ill-fated plane crash, that a monument and dedication to Lynyrd Skynyrd was unveiled. Lead singer Ronnie Van Zant's widow Judy, her daughter Melody, and grandchildren traveled from Jacksonville for the occasion. Guitarist Steve Gaines' daughter Karina and grandchildren also made the trip to take part in the ceremony, with this monument making sure that those lives lost that day will always be remembered.